Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but psychology tells a very different story. The quietest response can sometimes carry the deepest emotional weight, especially when it comes from an empath. Most people expect emotional pain to be loud. They expect arguments, tears, long conversations, or desperate attempts to fix what has been broken. That is why so many people become confused when an empath suddenly stops talking. One day they are patient, understanding, and willing to work through every problem. Then, without warning, they become calm, distant, and almost impossible to reach. Many assume this silence is meant to punish someone, but the truth is far more complex. An empath rarely becomes quiet because they run out of words. They become quiet because they finally realize that words alone cannot create understanding where there is no willingness to listen. Long before the silence appears, there has usually been a long period of emotional effort that no one else noticed. They explained. They forgave. They gave second chances. They tried to see every situation from another person's point of view. They carried emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. Yet one hidden fact about empaths is that their greatest strength can slowly become their greatest source of emotional exhaustion. Modern psychology suggests that people with high levels of empathy often absorb emotional stress more deeply than others, making repeated disappointment much harder to recover from. The silence that follows is not sudden at all. It is the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding quietly for a very long time. In this video you will discover what is really happening inside the mind of an empath when they stop explaining themselves, why endless understanding can eventually turn into emotional withdrawal, how repeated emotional wounds slowly change the brain's expectations, why their silence is often misunderstood by friends, partners, and family, and why this quiet phase usually marks a powerful psychological transformation instead of emotional defeat. You will also learn why many people realize the true meaning of an empath's silence only after it is too late, and why rebuilding trust after this point becomes far more difficult than most expect. The final part of this journey reveals one of the least understood psychological shifts in highly empathetic people, and it may completely change the way you interpret silence in your own relationships. Stay with us until the very end because every section connects to the next, revealing a deeper layer of this emotional process that few people ever recognize. Welcome to the channel, where we explore the hidden patterns of human psychology, relationships, and personal growth. If you enjoy thoughtful content that helps you understand yourself and others on a deeper level, subscribe now and join us for the journey. Empathy is often described as the ability to understand another person's feelings, but real empathy goes much deeper than simply recognizing that someone is happy, sad, or angry. It is the ability to emotionally connect with another person's experience while still knowing where their emotions end and your own begin. This is what psychologists call healthy empathy. A person with healthy empathy can care deeply, offer support, and remain emotionally available without losing themselves in someone else's pain. They can comfort a friend after a difficult day, feel genuine concern, and still return home carrying their own emotional balance. This form of empathy creates strong relationships because it combines kindness with healthy emotional boundaries. But not everyone experiences empathy this way. Some people move beyond healthy empathy into emotional absorption. Instead of simply understanding another person's emotions, they begin to absorb them as if those emotions belong to them. A tense room suddenly makes them anxious. A loved one's sadness feels like their own sadness. Someone else's anger stays with them long after the conversation has ended. They may spend hours thinking about another person's problems, even when they cannot do anything to solve them. Their emotional world slowly becomes filled with feelings that were never truly theirs to carry. Then there is hyper-empathy, where emotional sensitivity becomes so intense that it starts affecting daily life. People with hyper-empathy often notice tiny emotional signals that others completely miss. A slight change in someone's voice, a forced smile that hides disappointment, a pause before an answer, a different tone in a simple text message. These details seem invisible to most people, yet an empath's mind immediately begins searching for meaning. Sometimes those observations are accurate, but sometimes they create unnecessary worry because the empath assumes responsibility for emotions that may have nothing to do with them. This constant emotional awareness can become mentally exhausting because the brain rarely gets a chance to rest. Even during peaceful moments, it keeps scanning the emotional environment for signs that someone may be struggling. Many empaths do not even realize they are doing this because it feels completely natural to them. They walk into a room and instantly notice who seems uncomfortable, who is pretending to be happy, who feels ignored, or who is hiding frustration behind polite conversation. While other people focus on words, empaths often focus on expressions, body language, silence, and emotional energy. Their attention naturally moves toward emotional details before logical facts. This ability allows them to become wonderful listeners, supportive friends, caring partners, and trusted family members because people often feel understood without needing to explain every feeling. Yet this same strength quietly places an invisible weight on their shoulders. Every emotional burden they notice becomes another burden they feel tempted to carry. They often become the person everyone turns to during difficult times because they rarely judge and almost always try to understand. Over time, they begin solving problems that were never theirs, calming arguments they did not create, and comforting people who may never ask how they themselves are feeling. Harmony becomes more important than personal comfort. They would rather sacrifice their own peace than watch someone else remain upset. This is one of the hidden reasons why many empaths appear so calm. Their calmness is not proof that everything is fine. It is often the result of years spent managing emotions quietly instead of expressing them openly. While the outside remains peaceful, the inside can feel incredibly busy. Every conversation is replayed. Every facial expression is analyzed. Every disagreement is examined from multiple angles. They ask themselves whether they misunderstood someone, whether they could have responded differently, or whether they accidentally hurt another person's feelings. This deep emotional processing continues long after everyone else has moved on. That is why silence from an empathist should never be mistaken for emotional emptiness. It often means the opposite. The mind is working overtime while the mouth says very little. They stay calm because they are trying to protect the relationship before protecting themselves. Long before silence arrives, they spend countless moments preventing conflict from growing. They choose careful words. They avoid unnecessary arguments. They forgive small mistakes. They overlook behaviors that quietly hurt them because they believe understanding is more valuable than winning. Their silence does not begin on the day they feel hurt. It begins after they have spent a very long time trying to stop the hurt from happening at all. Because of this mindset, empaths rarely leave after the first disappointment. While another person may recognize an unhealthy pattern early and step away, an empath often pauses and searches for another explanation. Maybe that harsh comment came from stress. Maybe they are overwhelmed with work. Maybe childhood experiences made it difficult for them to communicate. Maybe next week will be different. Instead of judging actions immediately, they search for hidden reasons behind those actions. Their natural curiosity about human emotions makes them excellent at understanding difficult people, but it also makes them vulnerable to staying in painful situations far longer than they should. Every disappointment becomes another opportunity to practice patience. Every broken promise becomes another chance to believe things will improve. They do not ignore reality because they enjoy suffering. They ignore warning signs because they genuinely believe people are capable of growth. Hope becomes stronger than evidence. This pattern is supported by several psychological tendencies. One is emotional investment. The more time, care, and emotional energy people invest in a relationship, the harder it becomes to walk away. Leaving feels like abandoning everything they have already sacrificed. Another factor is optimism bias, the natural tendency to expect positive outcomes even when repeated experiences suggest otherwise. The empath convinces themselves that tomorrow may finally be the day things improve. They continue offering kindness because they remember moments when the other person showed love, even if those moments become increasingly rare. Then there is compassion fatigue. At first, compassion feels limitless. Supporting another person brings meaning and purpose. But over time, constantly caring without receiving emotional support in return slowly drains emotional resources. The empath still wants to help, yet every conversation requires more effort than before. Their emotional energy begins running low, but they keep giving because stopping feels selfish. This is where understanding quietly transforms into a trap. The more they understand another person's pain, the easier it becomes to excuse behavior that repeatedly hurts them. They become experts at explaining why someone acts the way they do, yet they rarely stop to ask whether those explanations actually change anything. Understanding another person's struggles is valuable, but understanding should never become permission for endless emotional neglect. A reason is not the same as an excuse. Still, many empaths confuse these two ideas because their compassion encourages them to focus on why someone behaves poorly instead of recognizing the damage those behaviors continue causing. Every excuse delays an important decision. Every second chance extends emotional exhaustion. Every hopeful thought pushes personal needs further into the background. Eventually, even the deepest well of understanding begins to run dry. From the outside, people often believe an empath changes overnight. They say the empath suddenly became distant, suddenly stopped calling, suddenly lost interest, or suddenly became quiet. But emotional change almost never happens suddenly. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, through emotional accumulation. A simple way to understand this process is to picture a glass sitting beneath a dripping faucet. One drop falls into the glass. Nothing happens. Another drop follows. Still nothing changes. Hundreds of drops continue filling the glass while it still appears perfectly stable. Then one final drop lands, and the water spills over the edge. Anyone watching only the final moment might blame that last drop, but the overflow was never caused by one drop alone. It was caused by everything that came before it. Emotional pain works the same way. Every disappointment adds another drop. Every broken promise adds another drop. Every ignored feeling, every forgotten apology, every lonely night, every one-sided effort, every conversation where their emotions were dismissed quietly raises the emotional level inside. The empath may smile, continue helping, and keep believing because the glass has not overflowed yet. But inside, emotional pressure continues building. Trust weakens one experience at a time, rather than disappearing all at once. Feeling emotionally invisible becomes one of the deepest wounds because the empath gives so much attention to others while quietly wondering why nobody notices their own pain. They listen carefully but rarely feel equally heard. They remember important details about everyone else's life while their own emotional struggles receive little attention. Relationships slowly become unbalanced. One person receives comfort while the other provides it. One person expresses frustration while the empath patiently understands. One person is allowed to make mistakes while the empath feels responsible for keeping everything together. Alongside this imbalance grows unspoken grief. It is grief for conversations that never happened, appreciation that was never expressed, effort that was never recognized, and emotional safety that slowly disappeared without anyone acknowledging it. This grief often remains invisible because the empath continues functioning normally. They go to work, smile politely, and fulfill responsibilities while privately carrying disappointment that nobody realizes exists. Then one ordinary event finally arrives. It may seem small compared to everything before it. Another broken promise, another careless comment, another forgotten need. To everyone else it appears like a minor issue, but for the empath it becomes the final confirmation that nothing is truly changing. The final event is rarely the real reason for the silence. It simply confirms what countless earlier experiences have already taught them. The glass overflows not because of one moment, but because every previous moment is finally impossible to ignore. When this point is reached, something important changes inside the empath's mind. They stop explaining themselves the way they once did. Earlier, they believed that clearer communication could solve the problem. If they found better words, perhaps the other person would finally understand. If they explained their feelings more gently, perhaps empathy would be returned. But repeated invalidation slowly changes the way people communicate. Each unsuccessful conversation teaches the brain that expressing pain may not lead to comfort. Instead, it may lead to dismissal, defensiveness, excuses, or complete misunderstanding. Over time, this creates learned emotional exhaustion. The empath no longer lacks words. They simply lack confidence that those words will make any difference. Emotional burnout replaces emotional persistence. Speaking begins to feel more draining than remaining silent. They grow tired of repeating the same needs in different ways. They become afraid that opening their heart again will only produce another painful misunderstanding. Protecting emotional energy suddenly becomes more important than winning another conversation. Acceptance quietly replaces persuasion. Instead of trying to convince someone to care, they begin accepting that genuine care cannot be forced. This is the hidden meaning behind the phrase, they stop explaining because they stop expecting to be understood. Their silence is not designed to punish anyone. It is a form of emotional conservation. They are saving the little emotional strength they still have, instead of spending it on conversations that history has taught them are unlikely to change anything. Yet the people around them often misunderstand this silence completely. One of the biggest misunderstandings about empaths begins after they become quiet. The people around them often notice the silence, but they rarely understand what it truly means. Instead, they fill the silence with their own assumptions. Some decide the empath has become cold and no longer cares. Others believe they are angry and trying to punish everyone around them. Some even think the silence is a form of manipulation, a silent game designed to make others feel guilty or desperate for attention. There are people who assume the empath is waiting for someone to chase them, apologize repeatedly, or beg for another chance. These interpretations seem believable because many people have experienced silence being used as a weapon before. In some relationships, silence is meant to control, create anxiety, or force another person to react. But this is where psychology reveals something important. People often interpret another person's behavior through the lens of their own habits. This is known as projection. Instead of asking why another person behaves a certain way, they unconsciously imagine what their own reason would be if they acted the same way. If someone personally uses silence to express anger, they naturally assume everyone else's silence also comes from anger. If they stay quiet to manipulate, they assume another quiet person must be manipulating too. They project their own emotional patterns onto someone else without realizing it. This creates one of the greatest misunderstandings between empaths and the people around them. The empath is not trying to create confusion. They are not secretly hoping someone will suffer. In many cases, they have simply stopped asking for emotional reciprocity because repeated experience has convinced them it is no longer possible. Emotional reciprocity means both people are willing to understand, support, and value each other's emotional experiences. Earlier in the relationship, the empath believed this balance could eventually develop. They listened carefully, communicated honestly, forgave mistakes, and continued offering patience because they hoped those efforts would be returned one day. But after enough disappointment, that hope slowly fades. They stop asking because asking has become emotionally exhausting. They stop reminding because reminders no longer create change. They stop explaining because every explanation feels like another conversation that ends exactly where it began. Their silence is not directed against another person. It is directed toward protecting themselves from repeating a cycle that has already caused too much emotional pain. Unfortunately, people who depended on the empath's endless understanding often notice this change only after it disappears. Suddenly, the person who always checked in no longer sends messages. The one who always solved conflicts no longer starts difficult conversations. The one who always forgave no longer reaches out after an argument. Those who benefited from the empath's emotional generosity sometimes mistake this withdrawal for cruelty because they had quietly become accustomed to receiving emotional support without giving the same amount in return. What feels like rejection to them is often simply the empath deciding that emotional balance matters too. This misunderstanding grows even stronger because silence removes opportunities for explanation. The empath is no longer trying to defend their intentions. Other people are left to create their own stories, and human beings naturally prefer explanations over uncertainty. The mind fills empty spaces with assumptions, and those assumptions are often shaped more by personal fears than by reality. While everyone else is trying to guess what the silence means, something much deeper is happening inside the empath that very few people ever notice. The most important changes rarely happen on the outside. They happen quietly within the mind. Emotional detachment is not a single decision made in one dramatic moment. It is usually a slow psychological process that unfolds over weeks, months, or even years. At first, the empath still hopes an apology will come. They believe the other person may eventually recognize the damage that has been done. They continue checking their phone with quiet hope. They replay conversations before falling asleep. They imagine different endings where both people finally understand each other. The relationship continues living inside their thoughts even when nothing changes in reality. But as time passes, the mind begins adapting. The empath gradually stops expecting apologies because experience has shown that waiting only creates more disappointment. They stop imagining different outcomes because imagination can no longer compete with repeated reality. They stop rehearsing conversations that will probably never happen. They stop wondering what they could have said differently because they finally realize the problem was never a lack of words. They slowly begin releasing the emotional attachment that once connected them so deeply to the relationship. This process is often invisible because daily life continues as normal. They still go to work, meet responsibilities, smile politely, and participate in conversations. Yet inside, emotional ties are quietly loosening. Psychology describes part of this process as radical acceptance. Radical acceptance does not mean approving of painful behavior or pretending everything was fair. It simply means accepting reality exactly as it is instead of exhausting yourself fighting against what cannot be changed. The empath reaches a point where they stop arguing with reality. They stop wishing another person had become someone different. They stop expecting yesterday to be rewritten. Acceptance replaces resistance, and although this sounds peaceful, it is often one of the most emotionally difficult stages because it requires letting go of hopes that once felt essential. Alongside acceptance comes the development of emotional boundaries. Earlier, the empath believed love meant unlimited emotional availability. They answered every message, solved every problem, absorbed every emotional storm, and believed endless patience was proof of genuine care. Now they begin learning that healthy love also requires limits. Caring for another person should never require abandoning yourself. Boundaries are not walls built to keep people out. They are guidelines that protect emotional well-being. For many empaths, creating boundaries feels uncomfortable at first because they fear disappointing others. Yet over time they realize that without boundaries, compassion slowly becomes self-neglect. Another important part of this transformation is self-preservation. Earlier, protecting others always came first. Now the mind quietly asks a different question. What happens if nobody protects me? This question changes everything. The empath begins conserving emotional energy instead of spending it endlessly. They become more selective about where they invest time, attention, and emotional effort. They understand that emotional resources are limited, and giving everything away leaves nothing for personal healing. One of the most surprising truths is that this emotional detachment often happens long before the relationship officially ends. Outsiders may believe everything is still normal because conversations continue or daily routines remain unchanged. But internally, the relationship has already begun fading. Emotional dependence weakens long before physical distance appears. By the time the final goodbye arrives, much of the grieving has already happened in silence. This explains why empaths sometimes appear calm when a relationship finally ends. Their healing process did not begin after separation. It began while they were still trying to save the relationship. Once this quiet transformation reaches completion, very little can reverse it because the change is no longer based on temporary emotions. It is based on a completely different understanding of reality. This is why so many people become shocked when an empath does not return emotionally. They expected time to soften everything. They believed a simple apology, a thoughtful message, or a brief period of kindness would restore the relationship exactly as it was before. Earlier in the relationship, that expectation might have been correct because empaths often forgave quickly and believed in fresh starts. But after emotional detachment has fully developed, returning becomes much more difficult. The reason is not stubbornness, it is emotional learning. Every painful experience teaches the brain something about safety. If touching a hot surface burns your hand enough times, your brain automatically becomes cautious around heat. Emotional experiences work in much the same way. Repeated disappointment teaches the nervous system which situations feel emotionally unsafe. Once emotional safety has been broken repeatedly, trust no longer returns simply because someone promises things will be different. Emotional safety is built through consistent actions, not temporary emotions. This is where many people confuse forgiveness with trust. Forgiveness is an internal decision to release resentment so that pain no longer controls your life. Trust is completely different. Trust must be rebuilt slowly through repeated evidence that change is real and lasting. An empath may sincerely forgive someone who caused deep emotional pain. They may no longer feel anger or desire revenge. They may genuinely hope that person finds happiness and grows into someone healthier. But forgiveness does not erase memory. The mind still remembers every pattern that created suffering. The heart remembers every lonely conversation, every broken promise, every moment of feeling emotionally invisible. Those memories become part of emotional learning, making blind trust almost impossible. This is why people often say, "I thought everything was fine because they forgave me." They mistake forgiveness for emotional closeness. Yet closeness depends on safety, and safety cannot exist where repeated pain has destroyed confidence. The empath is no longer emotionally dependent on receiving understanding from the same person. They have learned to create emotional stability within themselves instead of waiting for someone else to provide it. That quiet independence surprises people because they remember the empath who once fought so hard to keep the relationship alive. They fail to realize that the person standing before them has been changed by every painful experience that came before. The silence did not create this transformation, it simply revealed it. When viewed from the outside, silence appears empty. But inside an empath, silence often contains years of emotional growth, painful lessons, difficult acceptance, and the quiet decision to choose peace instead of endless struggle. It is not revenge because revenge still depends on another person's reaction. It is not manipulation because manipulation seeks control, while the empath has already released the desire to control anyone. It is not emotional weakness because choosing peace after repeated disappointment requires tremendous emotional strength. The silence represents acceptance of reality, instead of endless resistance. It reflects emotional maturity because the empath understands that not every relationship can be healed through love alone. It becomes an act of self-protection because continuing the same emotional cycle would only deepen the wounds that already exist. Most importantly, it marks the end of chasing understanding from people who repeatedly refuse to offer it. The empath finally realizes that constantly explaining themselves cannot force another person to listen with genuine empathy. Some lessons can only be learned through distance. Some relationships end emotionally long before anyone speaks the final words. In many cases, the loudest goodbye is the one that is never spoken because every conversation that once seemed necessary has quietly lost its purpose. The silence is no longer waiting for an answer. It has already found one. Every journey we explored today leads back to one powerful truth. An empath's silence is almost never the beginning of the story. It is usually the ending of countless invisible battles that no one else ever noticed. We have seen why empaths absorb emotions more deeply than most people, why they spend so much time trying to understand instead of judging, why they continue giving second chances even when they are hurting, and why emotional pain rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly through repeated disappointment, broken trust, and the feeling of carrying relationships alone. By the time an empath becomes quiet, they have often spent months or even years trying to protect a connection that was quietly falling apart. Their silence is not born from anger. It is born from acceptance. It is the moment they stop using their energy to convince someone to care and begin using that same energy to heal themselves. That is why silence can become one of the strongest forms of emotional growth. It is not about giving up on people. It is about refusing to give up on yourself. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that silence means nothing is happening. In reality, some of the biggest psychological transformations happen without a single word being spoken. The empath who once explained every feeling now learns that peace does not always require another conversation. The person who once carried everyone else's emotions begins carrying their own heart with the same kindness they once gave so freely to others. This is where real healing begins. Not when another person finally understands them, but when they no longer depend on that understanding to move forward. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has already fought the longest battle inside their own heart. Their silence is not empty. It is filled with every conversation they no longer need to have, every expectation they have finally released, and every lesson that taught them the value of protecting their own peace. If this journey changed the way you think about empathy, silence, and emotional healing, then there is still so much more to discover. The human mind is full of hidden patterns that quietly shape our relationships, our choices, and the people we become. The next step in understanding these patterns may completely change the way you see yourself and the people around you. So don't stop here. Continue exploring with us. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to like it because your support helps these ideas reach more people who may need them. Share this video with someone who would understand its message or benefit from hearing it. And if you're fascinated by psychology, relationships, emotional intelligence, and the hidden forces that influence human behavior, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and never underestimate the quiet strength that can change a life from within.